ringrazio innanzitutto il professor Sachs di essere qui con noi e di appunto respirare la nostra stessa aria, poca, qua dentro, e di essere presente per parlare di argomenti così importanti e così interessanti. Ringrazio anche la professoressa Mirolla che ha organizzato, diciamo, tutto questo, e i ragazzi che in qualche modo, studenti, hanno supportato la professoressa, me e altri nell'organizzazione di questa cosa. Io dirò soltanto, appunto, al di là del ringraziamento, pochissime parole, perché penso che oggi sia veramente importante ascoltare qualcosa che sicuramente sarà utile per tutti, anche se appunto il professor Sachs è professore alla Columbia University, è un economista noto a livello mondiale, e sembrerebbe appunto che ciò che lui fa non si relaziona veramente appunto con un ambiente come quello dell'Accademia di Belle Arti. In realtà abbiamo voluto questo anche per come negli ultimi 2 anni e mezzo l'Accademia di Belle Arti ha preso un percorso differente, un percorso che in qualche modo esalta di più la ricerca, esalta di più l'interdisciplinarietà non tra le arti ma tra i diversi campi del sapere, e quindi questo per noi è molto importante. Stiamo lavorando sulla ricerca in molte cose che appunto non sono legate solo essenzialmente alla ricerca artistica, ma come vi dicevo fanno incursioni in campi diversi, per cui per noi è fondamentale, per noi è proprio diciamo la base su cui lavorare e sentir parlare di argomenti come quello che appunto sarà dibattuto stasera, perché su quello costruiamo una visione che naturalmente è una visione con una modalità che ha più a che vedere con ciò che noi siamo, quindi con modalità che non vuol dire modalità artistiche, ma proprio con una visione, diciamo, da artistica. La sostenibilità, lo dice anche il comunicato stampa, ma insomma lo sviluppo sostenibile è qualcosa che tutti conosciamo, di cui tutti parlano. All'interno delle regole di questo sviluppo sostenibile, degli obiettivi che il mondo si è dato, che dovrebbero essere raggiunti entro il 2030, c'è anche quello dell'istruzione. È il punto 4. Il punto 4 dice garantire un'istruzione di qualità. Quindi anche per questo garantire un'istruzione di qualità significa proprio anche fare questi approfondimenti, significa in qualche modo cercare di aprire un orizzonte che sia un orizzonte diverso, sicuramente nuovo per tanti dei nostri studenti, e come vedete in questo momento sono tantissimi che sono qui evidentemente interessati a tutto questo, ma soprattutto è basato sulla ricerca. Io per la presentazione del professor Sachs passo la parola a Miriam Mirolla, e così dirà lei 2 parole e poi tutti in ascolto. Grazie.
Intanto grazie, buonasera a tutti di essere qui con noi. Farò una presentazione molto breve in inglese, abbiamo anche la traduzione simultanea. Siamo comunque onorati di avere qui il professor Sachs con noi. Allora, Jeffrey David Sachs is a university professor and director of the Center of Sustainable Development at Columbia University and president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He has been advisor to 3 UN Secretaries General and currently serves as an SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. We are going to meet a very special systems thinker, or we could say a systematic thinker. Step by step in his career, Professor Sachs was able to build a new vision of the world, creating a dialogue among different disciplines such as economics, geopolitics, social sciences, and environment. Each field of those is tremendously complex, but his main goal is to consider them deeply related in a complex system. In such an interactive and interconnected vision of the world, a central position is given by Professor Sachs to the concept of the future. That is to say, the capability of shaping and planning any possible action to solve the biggest problematics of our times, the dilemma between poverty and economic growth, the transformations of global societies, and the progressively intense collapse of the environment. In this very brief presentation of mine, I can only address 5 fundamental points or principles of what I define the Sachs system. And I can address them because those 5 principles are written in 5 books as solid bricks in the Sachs thought. The first, The Commonwealth, Economics for a Crowded Planet. The second, To Move the World, JFK Quest for Peace. Number 3, The Age of Sustainable Development. Number 4, A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism. And the last one, the 5th, Ethics in Action for Sustainable Development. These 5 principles of the Sachs system are designing a clear path for the future of humanity, thanks to the cooperation of other thinkers and multiple groups of research spread out all over the world. If creativity is a way of finding solutions to complex problems, our institution, the Academy of Fine Arts in Rome, is the right place to be tonight. Please, Professor Sachs, the stage is yours. Thank you so much.
Miriam, thank you so much for this wonderful, special invitation and that absolutely lovely opening remarks. So warm, and I appreciate them so much. And thanks to all the students and the faculty that are here to reflect on the complicated moment that we're in. It's a very dangerous time, actually, and we need to fix things. And opportunities like this to bring together you people of great creativity and great reach is very important and very meaningful for me, so I'm deeply honored to be here. I don't want to depress everybody, but we're not in a good place in the world right now. And we don't have assurance of getting to where we need to go in a very linear way. And I'll start with a really grim, unfortunately grim piece of news. Many of you will be familiar with the so-called doomsday clock, which was established by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 1947, 2 years after the atomic bomb was created and used twice in Japan. And the idea of the doomsday clock was that the small group of people in the world who understood the magnitude of what had changed with the advent of the atomic bomb were trying to tell the world that we are at an extremely dangerous moment in human history when humanity has the capacity to destroy human life, to end humanity. President John F. Kennedy, who's one of my favorite American leaders of my lifetime, put it very eloquently in 1961 in his inaugural address when he said, "For the world is very different now. Mankind holds in his mortal hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty, and all forms of human life. So in 1947, the atomic scientists were trying to convey the existential change of the modern age. And they put the clock at that time at 7 minutes to midnight. And since then, it has gone closer to midnight and farther away from midnight, depending on the geopolitics and the other realities of our time. When they took notice of the threat to humanity from climate change, they moved the clock forward. At the end of the Soviet Union, what seemed to be the end of the Cold War, they moved the hands of the clock farther from midnight. In recent days, they moved the hands of the clock towards midnight to just 90 seconds from midnight, the closest to disaster that they have ever indicated in their judgment. 90 seconds to Armageddon, 90 seconds to complete disaster. And it should tell us something. It may have been briefly mentioned in some news report before going into something completely irrelevant or talking about how important it was to ship new arms to Ukraine or something else. But the message is actually the deepest and most important message that we have received in a long time, which is that we are in great peril in this world. We are not well led, we are not well governed, and we have the capacity to destroy the world many times over, and we don't see the wisdom or the creativity to stay away from disaster right now. The last time that we were in such danger was 60 years ago, 60 years and 3 months in October 1962. And thank you, Miriam, for bringing a book. I wrote a book about this time because for me it was such a gripping time. By the way, I'm old enough that I remember being in 2nd grade, and I remember exactly outside which door of my primary school with a friend pointing to an airplane and saying knowingly to the airplane, maybe they're coming to bomb us. Because I remember how incredibly afraid my parents were watching President Kennedy give a speech to the American people about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I remember those days vividly firsthand. It was maybe my first political awareness in my life, actually. Maybe, yes, probably first, because my second was on my father's shoulder watching President Kennedy go by in an electoral motorcade in Michigan. That would be a month after that in 1962 November elections. We escaped from disaster in the Cuban Missile Crisis because of the wisdom of just a handful of people. And this is, for me, an extremely sobering reality of our fate right now. And if you want to understand that crisis because you're curious about it and to understand how the world works and doesn't work, a wonderful historian who passed away last year named Martin Sherwin wrote the finest book about the Cuban Missile Crisis ever written and that ever will be written, called Gambling with Armageddon. And I encourage you to read it if you're interested, because it is a minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the point of the book is we came within a breath of nuclear war. And to a significant extent, almost completely, not because anybody wanted it, but because we tripped one stupid move after another into nuclear war. And it's really important to understand this. Really important to understand this. I won't tell the whole history because I would keep you all night, although it's fascinating and important. But let me just say, starting backward because it's relevant for Ukraine, which is my topic this evening, the Cuban Missile Crisis had roots that went back to the very end of World War II. So it had a buildup of 17 years from 1945 to 1962. Things have history, they have a background. They're complex. By the way, they're hard to understand in part because our governments lie about everything. So you have to be able to parse the information and to understand it. And that's why great historians are so important also, but also for the fact that certain truths cannot even be known for 25 or 50 years because of secrecy, because of hidden materials and archives. Some things will never be known, obviously, certainly. But the Cuban Missile Crisis came from the failure to have a peace agreement after World War II. There was no peace settlement. And actually, one of the real fears of the Soviet Union was that Germany would rearm and threaten the Soviet Union again, because the Soviets had lost 20 million people in World War II. And of course, the West was afraid of the Soviet Union at the time. And so we had what's called a security dilemma, which is that each side viewed the worst of the other side, and each side interpreted every move of the other side, whether defensive or offensive, as a direct threat. And by assuming the worst, you ratchet the escalation. Well, the Cold War started in the late 1940s, and there's so much to say about it, but the basic point is the two sides never properly talked with each other throughout the 1950s. The American view was there's no one to talk to. The Soviet view was that they're out to destroy us. And there was merit on both sides of this argument, because there were certainly people in the US government that wanted a first nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. And no doubt there was a lot of grim, terrible behavior by the Soviet Union as well. So there was cause for distrust, but there was almost no relief of the distrust. And when the leaders met a couple of times, almost certainly something would go wrong. At the end of the 1950s, Eisenhower and Khrushchev were going to meet in a summit to try to reduce the tensions. And then a US spy plane flew over the Soviet Union and was shot down. And Eisenhower, the Soviets said, we shot down a spy plane. The CIA, which is an organization of blunders from beginning to end, told Eisenhower, well, the plane is designed, if it was shot down, it disintegrated, and the pilot would be long lost, and anyway, he had a cyanide pill, so they could never capture him. So Eisenhower went out and lied and said there was no spy plane, that was a weather plane that took off from Turkey and got lost. And then the Soviets showed, actually, we have the plane and we have the pilot, Gary Powers, and don't lie to us. So the president was caught in a direct lie, and that ended that summit. And I mention that because that was 1960. In the meantime, there was a Cuban revolution. Castro came to power. The United States immediately decided he's an enemy. Castro turned to the Soviet Union for support. And then Eisenhower decided, well, now we have to overthrow Castro. We will invade Cuba. And of course, that was the first thing that was put on the desk of the new young President, John F. Kennedy. He didn't like this plan. He thought this was a little bit harebrained, and he didn't think it was going to be very successful. But when the CIA says you must do this, and you're a new president, it went ahead. It went ahead with a lot of things to say, which I can't say because I don't have the time to explain the deeper history of it. But it went ahead in a half-hearted way. It was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a disaster. Castro knew everything about what was going to happen. Everything had been leaked. All of these Cuban soldiers under the CIA effort were captured on the beach at the Bay of Pigs. And Khrushchev wrote an indignant letter to Kennedy saying, "How dare you do this? Or no, he didn't actually say that in the first letter. What he said was very interesting. He said, Mr. President, I'm writing to you in a back channel that they had created. I'm writing to you to tell you that rogue elements of your government are committing an international crime at this moment in Cuba, and you must put it to a stop." Then Kennedy wrote back what I think is the worst thing he did, in the worst letter he wrote in his presidency, which was a back letter to Khrushchev saying, no, this has nothing to do with us. This is something independent of us. Because the CIA painted over the plane. It was crazy. And Khrushchev then wrote back a note, "How dare you lie to me again?" So it was the second major lie of a US president within a matter of months, basically. Direct lies. At which point Khrushchev said, let's teach them a lesson. And said to his foreign minister, let's put missiles into Cuba like they put into Turkey. And Gromyko, the foreign minister, said, what, have war? And very interestingly, Khrushchev said, war? No, this has nothing to do with war, God forbid. This is just to show them a little of their own medicine. It had nothing to do with a threat except, you do this, we do this. Well, to make a very long and interesting story short, of course, the weapons were put into Cuba, and then they were discovered by the same kind of spy plane, and Kennedy was shown the pictures of these missiles in a morning in October 1962. Now here's the point of my story. Kennedy assembled all his advisors. His brother, Robert, who I love, was my real first political love, who of course was killed a few years after John, and his Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor and his closest aide, Ted Sorensen, and the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and so forth, and they formed what's called the Executive Committee, or historians know it as XCOM. And it was taped, actually, which is one of the reasons why we know in detail everything about what happened. And this book by Martin Sherwin describes basically every minute of the 2 weeks of the Cuban Missile Crisis, step by step. Now, the point is the following. When they met, every advisor said, well, obviously we have to bomb these sites, take out these missiles immediately. Everybody agreed to recommend to the president, well, we have to take out these new sites. The CIA indicated these are not yet in place, so we have a few days to take them out. And there are 5,000 Soviet troops. We have to be careful not to start a direct war, but we have to bomb these sites. Now, almost always the CIA is wrong about critical facts. And so in this case, they were wrong because the missiles were already deployed. Had they done this, there would have been World War. Nobody to write the history would have been left. It would have been the end of humanity. Kennedy was very clever. Actually, he became great in this period. He said, let's try to understand this better. And he went off to lunch. By coincidence, his UN ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, was in Washington at that time, not in New York, and had asked President Kennedy, could we meet for lunch? By coincidence, Kennedy met with Ambassador Adlai Stevenson. And Kennedy showed Stevenson the photos of the missiles and said, what should we do? And Stevenson shocked Kennedy by saying, well, obviously you have to end this with diplomacy. Kennedy said, what? What do you mean? Well, we're going to have to negotiate this. For example, take out our Turkish missiles, they take out their Cuban missiles. And Kennedy said to Stevenson, you're the only one that says this. All my advisors say we should bomb this. And Stevenson said, no, of course not. Don't do that. That could lead to war, nuclear war. We have to have diplomacy. So Kennedy went back to ex-com, and this book describes the 2 weeks of what transpired. Basically, for several days, there was near or unanimity that we needed to bomb, and that the time was very limited because the missiles would be in place if we don't move quickly. And Kennedy kept thinking of Stevenson, and he kept asking them a question they weren't asking. What's on Khrushchev's mind? Why would he do this reckless thing? And he kept asking and not getting good answers. And then some back-channel communication started, and Kennedy started to realize maybe there's a way out of this. And there were approximately, at the start, 1, 2, 3 others that were urging peace, diplomacy. One was the Secretary General of the UN, Utant. One was Stevenson. And the third was Pope John the 23rd, who was in his dying days those days, already with cancer. And Kennedy was delaying because he wanted to understand what was really going on. And again, unfortunately, without being able to go at length into this, Kennedy came to understand intuitively Khrushchev didn't want war, and Khrushchev was in a parallel situation to Kennedy, surrounded by hardliners in a very fragile situation. Kennedy feared being impeached if he didn't take strong action. Kennedy feared his own advisors. They're all pressing me. The military is saying now, now, now. But maybe there's a way out. And of course, they discovered a way out. And that was the trade that Stevenson suggested at the lunch on the first day. That they agreed that the US will never again invade Cuba. The Soviet Union will retire its missiles, and the US will retire its missiles from Turkey. But Kennedy added a remarkable proviso. He said, you must keep the Turkish withdrawal of missiles a secret, and it cannot be part of this deal because it's a NATO matter and I need to get the approval of NATO and I can't bargain for NATO. Khrushchev incredibly did that, kept it a secret, in the US mind, Kennedy had forced a unilateral concession because it was only decades later that it was understood that this was diplomacy, not brinksmanship, that ended the crisis. It was never properly understood. And there's one more fact which is absolutely unreal. After this agreement was made and the crisis was over, so to speak, a disabled Soviet submarine in the vicinity of Cuba had been out of communications reach, and the US quarantine of Soviet vessels was still in place. So even after the leaders had agreed, not everybody had heard the word. Kennedy later said about a different incident, there's always one son of a bitch who doesn't get the news. In this case, it was the Soviet submarine commander. The vessel was disabled at the bottom of the Caribbean. It started to surface. In the US Navy protocol, the Navy could drop depth charges to get it to surface. Some jackass in the US Navy flying low-flying planes thought it would be funny to drop live hand grenades instead. So the submarine started to face hand grenade blasts as it was surfacing. It happened that in this squadron of submarines, this was the one submarine among the 7, I believe it was, in the squadron that had a nuclear-tipped torpedo. And the captain immediately ordered the nuclear-tipped torpedo into the firing bay because he knew that the vessel was under attack, and he assumed that there was a world war going on above him. And at the last moment, it happened because this was the one submarine that was the first among equals of this squadron. There was also a Soviet party official that had higher rank than the captain. And the Soviet official countermanded the order at the last moment and said, I don't think we should fire, we should surface. And literally, that man, whom you've never heard of, saved the world, literally. And you should know that it was the US military doctrine of the time that would have been enforced by Curtis LeMay, who is the figure who led to Dr. Strangelove 2 years afterwards, one of our nutcases in the US government, would have carried out the US order, which was if we have any nuclear attack, we are to go to a full nuclear attack against all enemies at full force. And what that meant at the time was the Soviet Union and China and Central and Eastern Europe. 700 million people were targeted. What they didn't know was what Carl Sagan taught the world years later, which is that would have ended all life on Earth because the nuclear winter effect would have ended all food production for decades to come. And we came within a breath of total global destruction. Okay, am I cheering you up? The world is governed by fools. The world is governed by irresponsible people. Russia today has 1,700 nuclear weapons. The United States has 1,700 deployed nuclear weapons. Each side actually has 5,000 plus, but deployed is 1,700. And we have politicians in Europe and in the United States who talk daily about defeating Russia. They are idiots. I'm sorry to say, there's no other word for it. Every historical analogy to World War II and to everything else makes no sense without an understanding of this basic reality. And then we're told once in a while, don't worry about it. Don't succumb to nuclear blackmail. Let me just tell you, first of all, worry about it. Okay? Worry about it. That's the first point. You should really worry about it. Second, you should understand that just like the Cuban Missile Crisis, this war has antecedents. And just like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States presidents have lied again and again and again. That doesn't exonerate Putin or Russia. It explains this as a crisis of two superpowers that lie to each other and that need to be apart from each other and that need to understand how incredibly dangerous it is to be having this escalatory war underway. The U.S. has lied repeatedly in the lead up to today. The lies started in 1992, because in 1990, the U.S. and Germany promised President Gorbachev that when the Soviet Union disbanded the Warsaw Pact, NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. That was not a casual remark. That was not on a fortune cookie. That was not on some person's fantasy. That was U.S. policy explained in repeated meetings to President Gorbachev, and by James Baker, and by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, and by the U.S. government and the German government. And those lies were repeated. But the United States decided in 1992, at the end of the Soviet Union, we are now the sole superpower in the world. We do what we want. And of course, within a few years, Clinton agreed with his neoconservative Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, and his neoconservative deputy, Richard Holbrooke, that NATO would start expanding. That was a huge lie. A second lie took place in 1999. Without going into all the details, NATO bombed Belgrade for 6 weeks straight. Bombed Belgrade. Part of it was Madeleine Albright not wanting Richard Holbrooke to sign a peace agreement with Milosevic, because then Holbrooke might become Al Gore's Secretary of State. I can't even explain how bizarre that sentence is. But actually, the U.S. was playing games and prevented peace and decided to bomb Belgrade. That's a bad idea. That was the first war in Europe after World War II, not this one, but NATO bombing of Serbia and breaking Serbia in two. That was not well received by Russia. Then NATO enlarged to 7 more countries in 2004. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. That was not well received, because now the Black Sea is getting surrounded. Then George Bush in 2008 proposed that NATO would enlarge to Ukraine and to Georgia. At which point Putin said, if you do that, that really is war. We will retake Crimea, which he said to George Bush in Bucharest in 2008. I consider that cheating by the United States, but also stupid, incredibly stupid. And by the way, European leaders knew how stupid it was. But when the US speaks, the European leaders shut their mouths. I don't know why. The US is not as wise as Europe. Europe has a lot of experience. A lot of bad experience, by the way, but a lot more experience. So tell Americans something. We're a new country, a little naive. But the Europeans just quiet, and the US pushed NATO. Then came a president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, who wanted a delicate balance. He said, my God, we are between the two giants. So he pressed the Ukrainian Duma, the Ukrainian parliament, I should say, to adopt neutrality. Smart, very smart. Europe pushed. Well, you must sign an association agreement. Russia said, you're already part of the Eurasian Economic Union. Europe should allow you to be part of both because we have our huge trade with you. And Yanukovych asked for a delay so that this could be sorted out. Well, demonstrations started in November 2013 in the Maidan in opposition, probably true peaceful demonstrations. But soon, Ukrainian right-wing paramilitaries joined, like the Right Sector and the battalions that we see today. Radical Bandera groups, and violence started in the Maidan in November and December. Then the United States said, oh, we don't know exactly what they said because we don't have the historian with the open files yet, but I'll tell you what I think they said. I think they said, you know, this could lead to the overthrow of Yanukovych and will help. And so the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, named Victoria Nuland, started traveling back and forth to Ukraine, meeting the insurrectionists, meeting the protesters, so-called. And American politicians poured into the Maidan, we're with you, we're with you. And I happen to know that we were paying a lot of money to the protesters and to the militarization of what occurred in January and February. I personally believe the United States played a significant role in the overthrow of Yanukovych. And I personally believe that the shooting that led to this bloodshed in the last days came mainly from the protest side, and that the policemen that were shot not by the self-defense, but they were shot with the same bullets that shot people in the crowds, and it was coming from where these Right Sector and others in Ukraine were stationed. I've read a lot about the evidence on this. All of it is to say, I believe that the United States helped to overthrow the government in February 2014. I think it's a lie to say that they did not. Well, Putin grabbed Crimea immediately after that. War broke out in the Donbass immediately after that. And so this war started with the overthrow of Yanukovych, not in February 24th, 2022. This war has been going on for more than 8 years. The US poured in vast armaments during this 8-year period. The US repeated on every occasion, Ukraine will join NATO. Germany and France said, we will help to secure a peace and the Minsk agreements were signed. Ukraine never followed through on the Minsk agreements. Former Chancellor Merkel said a couple of weeks ago, or now probably a month ago or 6 weeks ago, in a very strange interview, well, we didn't really mean to enforce those agreements, which would have given autonomy in the Donbass. We meant it as a time to build up the strength of Ukraine. That's not what the agreements say. The agreements are agreements between the parties of the Donbass and the central government of Ukraine that the central government never carried out. I'll finish this rendition by bringing us up to the eve of the war. In December 2021, President Putin put demands on the table. The demands were no NATO enlargement. Russia remains in Crimea. The Minsk II agreements are enforced, and other points. I read them and I said these are all negotiable. In fact, I support many of them outright as just wise things to do, because NATO enlargement to Ukraine is a reckless move. It's not a concession to not do it. It should never have been on the table. You know what? I called the White House at the end of 2021 and spoke to senior officials, said, negotiate with them, avoid the war. No, we can't negotiate over NATO. NATO has an open door policy. Funny, when Castro wanted to align with the Soviet Union, we didn't say, well, that's an open door. They choose who they want. We set the date of the invasion. It's not so simple, this open door idea with NATO. It's a terrible idea. It's a phony idea. There's no such thing as an open door of a military alliance. Big powers need to stay away from each other, not to come right up against each other. That's simple. But it's like children, honestly. But it's worse than children. Children you can put in their different parts of the room. These say no. So what were absolutely negotiable terms were flat out rejected by the White House, and the war started with the war escalated with Russia's invasion of February 24th. A month later, Zelensky said publicly, well, we could have neutrality if we have guarantees, and Crimea doesn't have to be settled now, and the Donbass, yeah, we have to find something to do. And what happened when he said that was that President Putin said to his top diplomats, and I know this also, put a document on the table of an agreement to end this based on those points: NATO non-enlargement, Ukrainian neutrality, and a timeline to settle outstanding issues. That was what was being negotiated in Istanbul and in Turkey. And I've spoken to a lot of the people involved. One day, Ukraine walked away from the negotiation saying, we're not negotiating anymore. We don't know why. My surmise is, it's my guess, that the US told them, you don't have to negotiate, you could win the war, we're going to upgrade our support. I don't know for sure. There are many stories about Boris Johnson going to tell the Ukrainians, don't negotiate. Boris Johnson isn't, if I may say, with all the respect deserved, which is very little, he's not a leading figure in this, but maybe he was carrying a message from the US, but most likely the US had carried the message beforehand. Whatever it was, that was the end of the negotiations till now. In the meantime, everything has worsened. 150,000 Ukrainian soldiers, more or less, have probably died in the interim. Cities completely leveled, 4 regions of Ukraine annexed to Russia by the Russian Duma. Unhelpful to get this resolved. And as far as I know to this moment, Biden and Putin have not communicated directly with each other one time in a year. Something I cannot believe, but I think it's accurate. At least we have no evidence of it, no mention of it. But that's worse than children. How can you go a year of a full war without even trying to communicate and trying to discuss? And to my mind, what the terms of a settlement would be are not so mysterious, though they change as time changes. But I believe NATO enlargement was a terrible, terrible idea and a lie from the start, but reckless and terrible for Ukraine to have bought into this, because it put them in a terribly vulnerable position. And I explained to Ukrainian counterparts, it's going to make you the Afghanistan of Europe, meaning the place that is endlessly at war. That's what I meant by that. They said, okay, we stopped talking to you, Professor Sachs. We don't want to hear that. These are friends. I've advised the Ukrainian government. I spent a lot of time with Ukraine. So I have no sides in this other than wanting peace now. NATO enlargement should be off the table. Crimea is not going back to Ukraine other than after a nuclear war. It's not happening. I could elaborate for a long time, but I'll suffice it to say that the NATO fleet of the Black Sea of Russia has been in Sevastopol since 1783. And one of the ideas of US NATO enlargement was precisely to surround Russia in the Black Sea, have no doubt about it. The idea was Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Georgia, surrounding Russia. That was what passes for intelligence in the US, which is just a good way to get ourselves blown to pieces. By the way, it's the same playbook as the first Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. And Boris Johnson, even more than wanting to be Churchill, wants to be Palmerston. If you know a little bit of history, Palmerston wanted to end the Russian Empire under the crackpot idea that what the Russian Empire really wanted to do was to invade British India from the Himalayas. That was the great game that they were seriously worried about. Big powers have no limits to their destructive imagination. So, ladies and gentlemen, it would not be hard, I believe, to find peace. The terms were reasonably on the table at least twice, December 2021 and March 2022. The underlying causes of this are real. They don't want you to know this, and the press doesn't want to cover this. Everything is dumbed down. Nobody wants history. Nobody wants clarity. Nobody wants to think. And Europe right now lacks diplomats because the diplomats have become the warmongers. The most warmongering official in Europe is the German foreign minister, Baerbock. Nobody speaks more militaristically. Schultz certainly not. And in Brussels, there's no diplomacy except more armaments for Ukraine. And the Secretary General of NATO literally said recently that weapons are peace. He's trying to outdo George Orwell. So peace is not impossible. It's not even far-fetched. My proposal is that the countries of the world outside the so-called West, which is the US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, the 5 Anglo-Saxon countries, and the European Union, and Japan and Korea and Singapore. That's the West, so-called. It's not the geographic West, but it's the US alliance. Other than those countries, and other than Russia, there are about 150 countries in the world that just want this to stop. That don't hate Russia, don't hate Ukraine, don't want sides, but also don't want Earth blown to pieces. One of them is led by one of the world's great leaders, fortunately again, and that is Brazil. President Lula has come back to office. He's a wonderful person, a wonderful human being, a wonderful political leader. He is smart, he is shrewd, he is decent, and he likes peace. And India feels the same way. And India has the presidency of the G20 this year. So while I am interested in Europe being intelligent again and understanding what's really at stake and having diplomacy, and the US I pray for, but I'm not holding my breath at the same time, because it's been a long time since we've had signs of intelligence in the higher reaches of the US state. Maybe the rest of the world could raise its voice. That's about 6.5 billion people in the world. And they truly speak, I believe, for all of us as well, that what we want is an end of this war and both sides to go home and stay away from each other. Thank you very much.